Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Winfree, and what you're about to listen to is a re-airing of an old podcast I used to host called Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. This particular episode originally aired on July 10th, 2013. It is a discussion of vampires. You can see the title. I trust you to know what's going on there. It features myself and Pat Mullin talking about a lot of vampires throughout the course of cinema and whatnot. No discussion of Dracula in particular. Dracula has his own episode, which should be re-airing shortly. Now, as mentioned, this episode originally recorded and aired in 2013, so there's a few more modern films and properties that are not discussed here. Uh, I would have almost certainly discussed A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, which is a very interesting, slightly more artistic style of vampire film. It's an Iranian quasi-spaghetti western vampire. It's a really interesting kind of mashup of genres, but a very, very interesting film. There's no discussion of I suppose we might have talked about the Netflix Castlevania series. Dracula's there, but so are a bunch of other vampires, and that, of course, would have prompted a non-trivial amount of discussion there. There's a lot of slightly more recent vampires that are not discussed. No discussion of the vampires from Doctor Sleep. The book hadn't even been written, much less the film that had come out. What We Do in the Shadows, either the original film or the television series that has spawned out of it, hadn't happened yet. So no discussion of that. Just giving y'all a few touchstones there for things that are not present because they had not exist. They didn't exist when we recorded this. So if you're interested in the discussion of those properties, I'd have to bring back the series, and at the moment, I don't think that's really on the table. There hasn't been some kind of great outcry of desire for it, so I'm kind of content to let things lie in the past. And as far as the show goes. Before we get into the episode, before I throw it to my past self, let's pay a few bills here. We have a couple of sponsors, per usual. First up, we have Grammarly. For you listeners of Everyone Loves a Bad Guy here on the W2M network, Grammarly is offering a free, completely free, download of the Grammarly software. Grammarly's AI-powered products help people communicate more effectively. Grammarly helps you write mistake-free on Gmail, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and nearly anywhere else you write on the web. Grammarly corrects hundreds of grammar, punctuation, and spelling mistakes, while also catching contextual errors, improving your vocabulary, and suggesting style improvements. To download Grammarly today, go to getgrammarly.com/W2Mnetwork. Again, that is getgrammarly.com/W2Mnetwork to download Grammarly for free. If you'd rather not type that into a search engine, there's a link in the description below. Our other our other sponsor is Amazon Music. If you like music, and who doesn't, Amazon Music has an enormous library, well north of 70 million individual songs, and vampires have long been associated with different kinds of music depending on what kind of vampire story you're telling. Whether it's the more classical symphonic stylings that went into the original Dracula films, the more 80s kind of synth-heavy stuff from the original Fright Night and the Lost Boys, all the way through to more modern stuff. I mean, Queen of the Damned featured a pop star in the lead role, also featured Forsaken, sung by Disturbed's David Draiman, all of which are available on Amazon Music. So if you're interested in that, go to getamazonmusic.com/W2Mnetwork. Fill out the little survey they say, tell them that we sent you there. You'll get 30 days to explore one of the largest streaming libraries of music, one of the best overall services in the entire music streaming services. It's great. If at the end of 30 days you like it, you can start paying for it. If not, you got a free 30 days to try it out. There is no downside. So, once again, getamazonmusic.com/W2Mnetwork, or click the link in the description below. Any of that works. All right, with that out of the way, let me throw it to my past self and Pat Mullin back in 2013 talking vampires. Past me, take it away.
When the devil is too busy and death a bit too much, they call on me by name, you see, for my special touch. To the gentleman, I'm the To the ladies, I'm surprised. But call me by any name, anyway, it's all the same. I'm the fly in your suit, I'm the pebble in your shoe, I'm the bee beneath your bed, I'm the bump on every head, I'm the heel on which you slip, I'm the pin in every head, I'm the thorn in your side, makes you wiggle and ride. And it's so easy when you're evil. This is the life you see, the devil tips his hat to me. I do it all because I'm evil, and I do it all for free. Your tears are all the pay I'll ever need.
Yes, good evening once again, and welcome to Everyone Loves a Bad Guy. I am your host, Robert Winfree, and tonight we're talking very specifically about vampires. I've got a great guest, and before we get going, I do want to make one minor technical announcement here. If you want to hear about Dracula, this is not the podcast for you. There will be no Dracula discussion tonight. We are pointedly discussing all vampires, not Dracula. Come back next week, same day, same time, and we will talk Dracula specifically. So if you want to hear about Dracula, next week. If you're done with every other type of vampire not named Dracula, you're in the right spot. We're here to talk vampire. Now, my guest today insisted on being part of the Vampires and Dracula group. He threatened me with physical harm, even though he lives in New York, and I'm pretty sure nothing good comes out of New York, I think. But he's here. He used to write for 411 Mania. He's been trying to get a comic book podcast off the ground, unsuccessfully so far, but it's Pat Mullin, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome him back. How you doing, Pat?
Good evening, Robert. Good evening, listeners. Yes, it is me, the thing that goes bump in the night because I guest host on this so often because I love the bad guys just as much as everyone else. And it's only appropriate I'm here on a night we talk about vampires because my prime hours are from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. My complexion is somewhat pallid, and I work with blood at night. Go figure.
Who'd have thought? Who'd have thought? Hey, maybe you're out. Maybe you work nights because you sparkle in sunlight and you're avoiding it.
Robert Winfree coming right out of the gate with a hard right hand.
I'm trying. Okay, I do want, since I just brought up the sparkly vampires, I know Twilight, big button issue with everyone, rightfully so in many cases. I want to very briefly discuss a couple of aspects of the Twilight Saga franchise, whatever you want to talk about. And let me say this. It doesn't bother me that the vampires sparkle in sunlight. A lot of purists, vampires are supposed to become, sunlight kills them. That's a hallmark of vampires. They drink blood, sunlight kills them. They're stronger than people, and there's a lot of gray area. Vampire mythology has been screwed with and tweaked with and messed around with. Everybody who writes a vampire story has their own take on the mythology. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, if you've ever read Bram Stoker's Dracula, and I have, and I love it, but some of the rules for him, he can't pass over running water. There's rules about the tides, where he can go when the water's coming or going. There's all of these complex things, and a lot of that has been left by the wayside, and by and large, I think we're all better off for it. So my point with Twilight, I don't dislike that the vampires sparkle. I don't even dislike that they're, what do they call themselves, vegetarians or vegans or whatever they refer to themselves as. To me, it's just the fact that it's kind of a weak retelling of Romeo and Juliet was what got my goat, but the amount of originality since Shakespeare is pretty much non-existent, so I did want to touch on that briefly. Pat, do you have anything to say on that particular series, books, movies, fan fiction, etc.?
I don't hate Twilight the way most vampire purists, I guess you'd call them, do. The sunlight thing is kind of a bothersome issue to me, because I think that's one of the always mainstay rules, is that sunlight will, if not kill, at least substantially weaken and harm a vampire. So I had a little bit of a problem with that. I think Twilight is, like you said, it's a retelling of Romeo and Juliet, the Capulets and the Montagues. I think it would have worked better, to be honest, were it just, this couple getting stalked by forces, trying to keep them apart from different worlds. I don't think the vampire element worked all that well for a lot of people. I think it could have been just as effective if they were normal humans, but then they draw it into a whole big fanatical world, and I understand that, and it kind of blends one of the overt natures of the vampire, which is sexuality, with love, without doing it in such a disturbing way to young adults who the series is geared towards. I think that was the ultimate goal.
It's aimed at teenagers, so there are rightfully so limits with what you kind of put out there. And on a side note, kudos to Stephanie Meyer for handling elements of that tastefully. That's not done very well very often, and I felt that she did well there. But I mentioned on the 411 at the end of the 411 Ground and Pound radio show this last Sunday that Twilight is indirectly/directly responsible for the rise in popularity of zombies over the last few years, because, as you just mentioned and has been mentioned many other times, vampires have this inherent kind of sensuality, sexuality, an appeal to being a vampire, to all of that stuff, and it can get twisted around. I mean, look, there's thousands of Harlequin romance novels with vampires there. I mean, they're everywhere, and with Twilight, I think it just kind of reached the breaking point, and you know what will never be sexy or appealing or young adult-oriented or betray us to the romantic side? Zombies. Zombies will always be horror creatures. Always. And I've had that argument with plenty of people, and so you want to know why you have the awesomeness of The Walking Dead? It's because of Twilight. Maybe an odd connection, but I stand by that reason. So,
Robert, who are you to say that brain eating is not sexy?
Well, of course the brain eating is. It's the rest of it.
Okay, as long as we're on the same page there.
Dude, eating brains is awesome. Did you not hear my Hannibal Lecter podcast?
I did. That's why I was a little bit taken aback by that, but I stand corrected.
I actually like that scene in the novel as much as I do in the movie, but again, different topic. So, since we're talking vampires, and since we have mentioned vampires are not always creatures of horror, so to speak. That's kind of how I define them is, they're a horror creature. They're originally horror creatures. I mean, almost every culture in the world has its own mythology that deals with blood-sucking fiends in the night. And that actually occurs in most cultures independently, dating back thousands of years. They've always been afraid of vampires, and rightfully so. Vampires are supposed to be scary. They don't always have to be, but I feel they're kind of supposed to be. But they have been reused for other purposes other than straight horror. So, since we're talking about that right now, let's go to the opposite side of the spectrum, since we've mentioned that vampires, again, since we're not talking about Dracula, but vampires that to you are scary. Vampires that you double-check your bedroom door for, that you worry about. I mean, if there are some vampires that make you hang a cross on your door to keep them away, what comes to mind if you're thinking of scary or intimidating vampires?
I think the big one, and I think everybody just from appearance alone would agree, has to be originally Count Orlok, the vampire from the original film Nosferatu, played by the late German actor Max Schreck, whose name actually translates in German to Maximum Terror, so very apt.
Hey, wasn't Max Schreck played by, I just forgot it, John Malkovich, I think,
Dafoe.
William Dafoe, yes, thank you. Yeah, he was played by in the movie about I forget the title of the movie, but
it was Shadow of the Vampire.
Shadow of the Vampire, yes.
One of the two.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
they make
a mock fictionalization of the making of a movie,
in which Max Schreck is an actual vampire, played by William Dafoe. Awesome stuff. I would agree. Now, one of the and I know we kind of agreed not to talk too much about Dracula here, but I have to mention, since we're talking about Nosferatu and Count Orlok, you have to mention a little bit that if you've read Dracula, the original appearance of Dracula is not for want of a better phrase, the Bela Lugosi. He doesn't originally appear as the well-dressed, well-mannered, well-spoken nobleman that he becomes later, but originally he is described very insect-like, and I think that with Nosferatu, they actually stayed fairly true to his original description of Dracula.
Yeah, there is not a more real terrifying-looking being than Count Orlok in Nosferatu. He is, completely bald, no visible signs of hair on his head, bat-like pointed ears, very jagged, rigid teeth in the front of his face, extremely long fingernails, deep-set, very dark eyes, extremely tall, extremely slender, the long, jagged fingernails, just about as creepy as you can find. There's one particular scene where Count Orlov, just levitates forward out of his coffin in the film, and it is still one of the scariest moments in any movie. I defy you not to be frightened by that to some degree.
Well, you gotta love the Germans. The German, I think that was German, wasn't it? Nosferatu?
It was F.W. Murnau, yes.
Yeah, so that's German, like, I forget the phrase. Expressionism, something like that. I can't remember it. And it's going to bug me until I remember it, but I will later.
Well, it's right along in the era of Metropolis and all of those German films that were released at the same time.
Yeah, they're really kind of ethereal and they're dreamlike in quality, and it's a very interesting genre or style that you can to study and to look at if you're a film student or what have you. But yeah, Count Orlok is a very creepy-looking. To me, vampires kind of get scarier in a lot of cases the less human they look. And there's a lot to be said for a vampire that just looks human and can walk among you and can still be scary. But when you see something like Orlok or I'm trying to think of another decent example. Oh, okay, since we're go ahead if you have one.
I was going to say maybe the 30 Days of Night vampires.
Oh, man, I had a couple of issues with those vampires. I get what you're saying that they should, they don't you look at them and they kind of look off.
They don't look human. Yeah, they don't really look all that humanoid. They're kind of a bastardized almost version of Orlok to an extent with the teeth.
My personal problem with that was watching the movie, and I know that the movie and the graphic novel have some differences, but in the movie, if you've seen it, they always walk around with these open mouths, kind of like they're always perpetually shocked at something, and I think it's just bad prosthetic work on their teeth.
Yeah, that they overexpose that to much too much an extent. It's sometimes like you were saying, less is more, and to that was just in the appearance factor. They'd look less human, but that was a case where they had a good idea and it just was done to death because they didn't have any other ideas and just shot themselves in the foot.
Yeah. Also, kind of in that same vein of not looking human, we discussed that we're going to talk. We mentioned that we're going off there that we're going to talk about, for want of a better phrase, the Whedonverse vampires. And I thought that was a nice trick that he kind of came up with. Of the vampires can look normal, or they can sprout fangs and alter the facial prosthetics that they get, and they suddenly don't look human anymore. And in that respect, they can go from being, specifically if you're watching like Spike or Angel, and they're looking human, and then all of a sudden, a bit of that inner demon, the darkness within them comes out, and it's a nice visual cue. I don't think the sequence, I'm going to get a little Buffy nerd here, but there's a sequence in season 2 where Angelus is chasing the teacher that he winds up killing. I forget her name. But
Giles' girlfriend.
Yeah, and I love that whole sequence, actually, but I don't think it's nearly as powerful if he doesn't have, the vampire face on the whole time. It just adds the extra element of Jenny Calendar, that's her name. My memory comes through again. But it adds that extra element of this is something not of this world that is chasing you, and you definitely need to be afraid.
I think that's part of the great duality of a lot of the vampires in myth, legend, folklore, television movies, is that there's, they are cunning hunters at their base level. And so the fact that they have that ability to camouflage themselves, for lack of a better word, just like somebody wearing camouflage in the desert looking for an 8-point buck, and then sneak up on their prey while they're unseen, and then finally, instead of pulling a bow and arrow or a gun out, this change comes over them, and you see, oh wait, this isn't what I thought it was. It's very cool and was very well done, I thought.
Yeah, I agree. And when it was done right, part of the greatness of that whole sequence is, the two big ones there obviously are Spike and Angel, and the acting of James Marsters and David Boreanaz to portray both of those characters. Spike starts out as a bad guy and gradually becomes more human. Angel has his soul periodically ripped out or put back in him, and it's a credit to their acting skills as well that they're able to convey, being more than just a mindless killing machine at times.
Yeah, Boreanaz just has that ability to look like, a sad puppy who's just been kicked, and then all of a sudden, once that facial change comes over him and he embraces it, he's the hunter.
Yeah, his ability to change, his ability to emote with his face and to change on a dime like that is a real asset to him as an actor. He does it he does it throughout his appearances on Buffy, more than a few times in the series Angel. Even, we'll break out that same type of thing on Bones if you happen to watch that. I mean, different character, obviously, but kind of the same technique there. So we talked a little bit about that. I'm sure we'll circle back around to those guys again because I enjoy them. So I'm going to ask you, what are your kind of low points for vampires? What are some vampires that you think of that get you to roll your eyes a little bit? Because there are some bad ones, and I don't just mean versions of Dracula, because there are some bad ones of those too. But if you can think of a specific movie or a character or sequences of, again, books, comics, television, movies, whatever, that just kind of makes you roll your eyes and go, really?
Yeah, we'll definitely leave off the bad iterations of Dracula because there's a few we can talk about next week. But there were a few for sure. And if I really have to single one out, it's kind of tough. But I may have to go with Robert Quarry's Count Yorga movie, and I feel bad saying that.
No, go ahead. Explain yourself.
Robert Quarry is not
with
a bad actor. He's really not, and I think he does well with what he's given. But those movies are made to be so surreal and laughable while still trying to play it straight that they kind of have an identity crisis, and you end up laughing very stupidly at parts throughout the movie. And the way the vampires are portrayed, where there's seemingly no reactions given to certain things, and I'll spoil some of the movies for you. So if you haven't seen Count Yorga, which I don't know how you haven't if you like vampires and you're listening to this, it's been around since 1970 was the first iteration. Count Yorga is seemingly killed for sure in the first movie, and yet he's inexplicably brought back in the second movie out of nowhere with no explanation given. Things like that, where the movies clearly don't even take themselves seriously at that point. You kind of have to say, how am I going to be able to enjoy this if they're not even trying? And Count Yorga, again, is kind of the stereotypical vampire where he's wearing the dinner jacket and he's from Eastern Europe and he has the amulet on and kind of plays up the bad vampire stereotypes that have been set forth since Bela Lugosi's turn as Dracula.
It's so sad that gets... when you see the original Dracula movie, you understand how great Lugosi was in it, but great things tend to be prone to copying and mockeries. You go, one of mine that I can't help but laugh at in not necessarily a good way. I don't know if you've seen the movie Fearless Vampire Hunters or not.
Oh yeah, Roman Polanski.
Roman Polanski, Ferdy Mayne as the vampire. It is so bad. I mean, it's meant to be comedy, so don't get me wrong here. It's not taking itself seriously, and I'm laughing at it. It's meant to be funny, and I'm still just kind of shaking my head at it. That movie. There was a famous interaction between Christopher Lee and Ferdy Mayne around that after it was released. Apparently, Christopher Lee went up to Ferdy Mayne and said, "How dare you make a mockery out of something that's supposed to be taken seriously?" Of course, he was joking when talking to the actor, but still.
Yeah, I mean. The stuff in that movie, like some of it is laughable for sure, but then you get parts where it's just you don't know where the movie's going. Like the dance hall scene, for example, where at one point the fearless vampire killers of the titular, nature, and their young accomplice who they're trying to save, played by the late Sharon Tate, they're trying to masquerade and fit in at a vampire ball, which to me was silly enough. The only thing I can liken it to is if you've ever seen the movie The Max, and they have what's called the Players' Ball, which is a very famous scene in urban cinema now. And that was the only thing that came to mind that it reminded me of, because I couldn't figure out why vampires, of all people, would get together and wear powdered wigs and have, a very, glamorous ball, nor why they would have mirrors set up in the hall.
Well, why do scenes like that have to make sense? It's a Polanski film, right? No, never mind that there's a sequence almost exactly that same way in the movie Van Helsing, which we will get to next week when talking about bad Draculas. In a bit of guilty pleasure, I actually enjoy that movie as a popcorn movie, as kind of a fun send-up to the Universal monster movies. There's just some things about it I really don't care for. Have you seen that one? No, I'm talking about Van Helsing.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I've seen Van Helsing, and I wish I hadn't.
I can kind of enjoy it as a popcorn flick, but it's one of those that maybe could have been so much more than it actually wound up being.
I think unrealized potential is something that we run rampant with here on this show.
Yeah, definitely. But one of the other vampires that we kind of talked about a little bit, and let's just kind of get this one out of the way. the Anne Rice series of Vampire Chronicles, her gothic stuff, features primarily the vampire Lestat. And I'll say this, I'm not a huge fan of Anne Rice. I'm not a huge fan of Lestat as a character even. I mean, to me, that whole series is just it's kind of like Twilight aimed at a slightly older audience and trying to maybe walk more of an edgier line, but it just isn't willing or able to go further into it, so it just kind of winds up like a PG zombie movie, for want of a better phrase. I mean, it never quite commits one way or the other to the tone that it wants to establish or its content, and it kind of falls flat for me.
Yeah, I read two of the novels. I read the actual Interview with the Vampire book, and I read Queen of the Damned, which also had a movie made, and the less said about that, the better.
Yeah, poor Leah. To go out. For those of you who don't know, it was Queen of the Damned, a movie starring former pop star Aaliyah, and she died not too long before its release. I believe she was in a car accident. I could be wrong, though. But she was the main star, the leading role, and it was just really sad because she'd actually done a bit of other acting work that wasn't awful, and that movie was just so bad. It was all over the place, just so bad.
Yeah, through no fault of her own, mind you. But yeah, those novels.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Those novels and those films are really, you can see the definite relationship there between, and draw parallels between those and Twilight, and that the protagonist of Lestat is initially thought to be this monster, but then they kind of make him more of an anti-hero than anything else, and he goes out of his way, and even when he first becomes a vampire, to do nice things for his family, and he pays off his old boss's debts and buys the theater that he worked at, and kind of loses sight of what the vampire was invented for, and it's to be this evil entity that was human at one point but is no longer human. Despite the appearance, despite everything else, this is not a human. This is an evil being bent on, destruction and drinking blood and feeding.
No, I agree. I think the notion of, the romanticizing of vampires it's a dangerous thing because it's so easy to take it, a bit too far, and you lose what makes them interesting and intriguing. And in another odd bit of credit I'm going to throw out to Twilight, they actually managed not to do that. I mean, yes, you have the whole Cullen family and their support group of vegetarian vampires or what have you, but it's also made very clear that the vampires that don't subscribe to that way of life are not to be screwed around with. They're pretty serious, and
yeah, the Cullens were not the norm there.
Yeah, whereas Lestat is kind of he's a bit off the mark for other vampires within that world, but he's not that far. He's maybe a tad odd as opposed to like the crazy cat lady.
Okay.
I mean, if you got within the setting of like a town, if you're looking at if you take the character of Lestat and you put him in in a vampire town, like something like even like the Twilight world or the world of Salem's Lot from Stephen King, most vampire worlds he would be akin to the crazy cat lady, who makes no sense whatsoever. Within the context of Anne Rice's world, he's maybe the guy with a couple of odd tics who was in a bad car wreck or was traumatized in a war or something. He's maybe something of an oddity, but he's not that far off the mark. Whereas with others, he's the crazy cat lady.
That is the single best analogy we've made yet on this show. I am so proud to have been a part of it.
Well, I'll try to break it out at some other point then. Since I just mentioned Salem's Lot, I haven't seen the movie, although I know it changes very little from the book. I have read the book more than once, Stephen King's Salem's Lot. So, since you've seen the movie, you can maybe speak to some of the things as far as that goes that I can't. When discussing, in the forward or afterward, one of the two, of Salem's Lot, I believe, or it's in Dance Macabre, and I'm misplacing it, which could very well be, but Stephen King talks about the kind of vampire he wanted to create, and this maybe goes to the kind of dichotomy of vampires or their versatility, because he talks about being scared by Dracula, who is very kind of a menacing figure, but at the same time, he's described more than once as sipping delicately at someone's veins. He's still very much a gentleman. And yes, he's scary, but he's kind of refined. And then he goes on to mention that in pulp graphic novels, pulp comic books, when he was a kid, they had vampires who would tear people's throats out and install taps where their heads used. I mean, just very, very gory and brutal, and as was kind of typical of horror comics of the time. And that those particular vampires didn't just scare him, in a direct quote here, they fucking terrified him. And he said that he made an effort to kind of create a hybrid between those two styles of vampire within Salem's Lot. And for my money, he did a very good job. I mean, Barlow remains an extraordinarily menacing figure, and he's kind of like we talked about with, some of the 30 Days of Night vampires. You look at him, and yeah, he looks human enough. I mean, the form is still there, but there's something just off about him, and you can recognize it immediately.
Yeah, and in the film adaptation, the guy doing the special effects is one of the legends of, horror special effects, Tobe Hooper, who's done so many movies and has so many credits and great work to his name. Initially, when you see the vampire for the first time in Salem's Lot, when you see Barlow, it's like Nosferatu with the volume turned up, because they were able to do more with the advanced technology of the time. He still has, appendages like a human and a head and, eyes, a nose, and a mouth, but man, nothing remotely human looking other than that. The teeth are ramped up from what Nosferatu was. His skin is more of a bluish color than what we saw with Nosferatu. And the type of feeding he does, you don't see him, gently caress the victim and all of a sudden just hang on their neck. They won't show it to you because TV wouldn't let you show what Stephen King wrote him doing in that book, because it was that graphic. And they didn't want to tone it down either. And that, again, goes to kind of the theory that it's the things you don't see that are sometimes more terrifying than what you actually see, because it's left to your imagination. And when you're put into that position, you tend to have a worst thought possible process going on. And the vampire Barlow, oh my goodness, what a horrifying creature he was. And it's such a good adaptation. The whole thing is actually on YouTube if you search for it. Somebody's not been nice enough to put it up since it hasn't been released on DVD yet. But really, and the vampires in that movie, there are some of the townspeople who get turned and are then brought to a hospital or cemetery, and the thing that they did that I found different from what they usually do and worked is they give them these soulless, pupilless eyes that are just locked on to whomever they're talking to, and it is so horrifying. My God.
Well, for me, I think the scariest part of that came, and again, you say they don't change anything too much, so I have this picture in my head of probably the scariest sequence in the book, for my money, is the bus driver of the local school is cornered in I think it's the junkyard is where he is at the time. He's cornered within his school bus by all of the kids that he drives, and he's kind of a jackass. To be fair, I think most bus drivers suffer like that because they're exposed to small children all day long, and that is not good most of the time. But the guy's kind of a jackass, and all of the small children, and we're talking primary school, and they're all now vampires, and they ambush him on his school bus, and that whole sequence, with staring pupilless eyes on these giggling children as they surround the bus and just come in, and eventually they tear him apart. But that's some scary stuff, man. Whenever you talk about vampires, they don't have to be, you just got to see it done right, and it will scare the hell out of you.
Yeah, they actually did omit that from the series, but what they did not omit is at one point the main child actor in the film is Lance Kerwin, who plays the role of Mark, who's the lead child in the novel and the story. And Mark's friend one night is out alone and, of course, is taken by Barlow and vampirized. And there's a point in the movie where, and it's in the book too, where there's just a tapping on Mark's window at night, and Mark, can't believe what it is. He doesn't know what's going on. Why is there tapping on my window? And all of a sudden you see this vampire child, and it's just levitating outside of his bedroom window on the second floor of the house in like a long nightshirt with just these graphically distorted features, but you can still tell it's his friend. And the kid is so horrified, and the window opens and there's smoke around, and he's just waving Mark to him so he can feed on him. It is terrifying.
Yeah, that's a great sequence. The vampire, levitating outside the window, and of course it was done in The Lost Boys as well, which I caught some flack from Mark Radulich because I mentioned some of my issues with Twilight, and he said, "Oh, you're like everyone else. You just go, why can't every vampire movie be The Lost Boys?" And I said it there, I'll say it here. I'm not a huge fan of the Lost Boys movie. I'm sorry. I know why people are. I can agree to disagree here, but I didn't much care for it. But they have a scene very much like that in that movie. It's in the Stephen King book. It's in Salem's Lot. One of my favorite Simpsons Halloween shorts, of course, is the one with the vampires and Bart on the outside tapping on the window to get Lisa to come talk with him, followed by one of the greatest Simpsons gags of all time, I think. Bart comes in and he's going to bite Lisa, and Homer comes and they come in, "Don't bite your sister," and, "Hey, wait, you are a vampire," and then Grandpa Simpson busts in and goes, "Quick, we have to kill the boy," and he's got the wooden stake and the mallet, and then Marge pokes her head in and goes, "How do you know he's a vampire?" And Grandpa goes, "He's a vampire." Ah!
That was Treehouse of Horror, I want to say 3, which is still awesome to this day.
Oh yeah, I love that. That's one. I can't remember. Yeah, that's the one where the setting is in the gallery. That's also got the gremlin on the side of the bus, and what's the other one? I can't remember it because they said it with Bart hosting like the old night gallery anthology television show. So he's stopping in front of paintings, and one of them is the school bus, and then the last one's supposed to be
the other one
dogs
might be
playing
Homer
poker.
Simpson and the Devil, where he sells his soul for a donut.
I don't think it's in that one, but I think that's my all-time favorite Halloween short. But it might be, and I'm just misremembering. But I think Mr. Burns makes a great vampire in that short one too. I mean, there's never been a better vampire.
The fact that he's already got Nosferatu's features doesn't hurt.
I know. I don't think there's a lot better vampire than Mr. Burns. If you were to create a vampire, he's perfect.
Yeah, making him a vampire doesn't make him seem all that less evil than what he was to begin with either.
No, I'm going to do one of these things dedicated just to Mr. Burns because he's such a great villain, I think, at some point down the line. But one of the other things about, and again, we try to frame this around vampires as bad guys, but they don't necessarily always fall into that category. So stepping kind of outside the realm of all vampires are bad guys, I'm curious as to get maybe some of your impressions, a vampire that's a hero, and kind of what type of opposing force you need to have against the vampire to make it a believable hero, because again, a hero is only as good as the villain. I mean, I maintain that's kind of my philosophy here. So if you have a vampire as the hero, as kind of the sympathetic role, in your opinion, what is a good one as an example, and what kind of opposing force do you need against it?
Well, I think one of the ones we talked about prior to air is one of the better characters we've seen, and actually he was a better character after a reinvention, was Blade, the titular hero of the movie series, the comic series, best known probably for the Wesley Snipes movies. But I think that right there is a great example of a vampire who is the hero and is the vampire slayer.
No, I agree. We definitely have to talk about Blade as far as this goes. So as far as Blade goes, I didn't realize this for quite some time, actually, but my first exposure to Blade came in the old Spider-Man the Animated Series. There's a series of episodes, two or three, I think, an old 30-minute Saturday morning cartoon, but one of a friend of Peter Parker's becomes a vampire, and he has bluish skin, and he has these suction cup-like things on the palm of his hand, and that's how he absorbs plasma.
Can't show body on a Saturday morning cartoon.
Yeah, it's true. And in the course of this vampire, and they're trying to find a way to help him and whatnot, and Blade makes an appearance to hunt down this vampire because that's what he does, and he has the laser sword and the motorcycle that will go up vertical walls, and again, it's him, and Whistler's there too, and I didn't realize it until again much later that that's actually Blade, because it was much later that I saw him in the first Blade movie with the great Chris Christopherson as Blade, and Stephen Dorff doing a great job as Eric Frost as the opposing force there in the first Blade movie. That's like, he was in Spider-Man, wasn't he? Because he did start in comics and he did do some crossovers. Sorry, go ahead.
Blade's a pretty interesting character because he actually started off in the 1970s. Marvel Comics was very big to jump on exploitation bandwagons, and in the 70s there were a lot of genres getting a lot of play in pop culture. There was the martial arts genre, so they invented Shang-Chi, the master of Kung Fu, and Iron Fist, and to capitalize on the vampire craze, they had a comic called Tomb of Dracula. They had a horror series for a werewolf, horror series for Frankenstein. in the pages of the Dracula comic, they decided to experiment with a blaxploitation character whose name was Blade, and Blade was very much a stereotypical kind of blaxploitation movie character where he spoke jive and he had an afro and he dressed in bell bottoms and very discoed up. But it also happened that Blade was partially a vampire because Blade's mother was bitten by a vampire while pregnant. A vampire named Deacon Frost, who was portrayed in the movie by Stephen Dorff, like you said.
Eric.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm kicking myself for saying Eric and not Deacon, but
minor difference. But we're here to talk about Blade. And Blade, because of his birthing, was granted certain immunities because he wasn't fully a vampire. One of the big ones is what he's referred to as the Daywalker. He can walk through sunlight without any kind of harm being done to him. And because of his only half vampirical nature, he has a better time controlling his feedings, and he does this through the help of a veteran vampire hunter named Whistler. In the movies, played by the awesome Chris Christopherson. And they do this through a serum and ways of obtaining blood through things like pigs and what have you to keep him in check so that he doesn't feed on a human and give in to his dark side.
Yeah, and since we're talking about forces that you need to oppose a vampire, and we're talking about Blade, I think we'd be horrifyingly remiss not to mention Blade 2, which, I have been on record before saying I love the work of Guillermo del Toro. Devil's Backbone, The Orphanage, of course Pan's Labyrinth. The first Hellboy, not as much as the second Hellboy and whatnot, but I'm a huge fan of the man's work. I think it's a crying shame that we still can't, for some reason, get a studio to support and finance him making a movie of At the Mountains of Madness. But I'm also a huge H.P. Lovecraft fan, so there is that too. But he took over the Blade franchise for the second installment, I believe. He may have done the first two, but I love the second one, and a huge part of my love for the second one is they're referred to as the Reavers, the genetic mutation that it turns out it's created by the Count Orlok-looking vampire patriarch. But you have, I believe it's Luke Goss, who does such a great job as the main Reaver, and those the vampires in the Blade series, they're pretty, they're menacing. They're not you don't screw around with. But the monsters that they created with the Reapers are just the next level of the way their jaws come apart and the amount of blood as they feed. The whole movie is framed more as an action movie, and I think it's kind of a good thing because if you put those monsters in a horror setting, they're scary enough as it is. You don't need to use a lot of the horror sensibilities and techniques to make them intimidating and scary.
No, and it's so well layered because Blade is absolutely feared and despised by every vampire walking the planet because they know eventually he's going to come for them, and if he sees them, it's on. How bad must these Reavers be to the point where the vampires actually have to recruit Blade to help them kill these things so they can survive because they'd rather deal with him than the Reaver?
And, of course, that particular group who's been trained to hunt Blade, led by the great Ron Perlman, who is a great vampire. But Ron Perlman's pretty much a great anything, I think.
He's a great vampire, and what I love that Guillermo del Toro did here is he underlined the vampire character. Because finally, Blade and these guys are working together, they're getting through everything, and what happens? Ron Perlman turns on him as soon as it's convenient, because that's what a vampire is. It is a soulless being, just out for its own intentions, doesn't give a damn about paying debts. It's a vampire. It's there to feed. Just like the old, proverb of the lady freeing the snake from the thorn bush and then getting bit after and saying, "Why did you bite me? I'm a snake." It's their nature. It's what they are.
It's in my nature. You knew what I was when you let me out. I always get a kick out of that particular proverb because it goes along. Everyone has a version of it. Of course, kind of the famous version of that one is the Aesop fable of the scorpion and the frog, where the scorpion goes along and comes to a lake and he can't cross it, and there's a frog along there and he asks the frog for a ride. The frog says, "No, you're a scorpion, you'll sting me." And the scorpion replies, "No, if I do that, we'll both drown. That's out of self-preservation, I have to not sting you." And the frog goes, "Oh, okay." So the scorpion gets on him. They get out about 3 feet into the lake, and the scorpion stings him. And the frog goes, "Why? Now we're both dead." And the scorpion goes, "It's in my nature. You knew what I was when you put me on your back."
It's exactly what it is. And you would think Blade would have been smart to it, but again, you got to put your hero up a tree. And at that point, he'd been up the tree and got back down. found out he was only at the second layer of the tree and still had a ways to go.
Yeah. And again, I forget who plays the vampire Damaskinos in that one, but whoever it is does a great job as physically not being a threat to Blade. He's a much older vampire. He, again, looks like Count Orlok. He has bereft of hair, has kind of the funky ears, stooped over, but he is still a very menacing and threatening character. And I
almost
want
like
to
the Master in Buffy to an extent.
Yeah. And it's such a shame, I think, looking back on that they weren't able to stretch him out for at least part of another season because, although, of course, the Master was physically quite strong as well, but he was scary enough to, his first encounter when Buffy goes down into his lair is actually pretty, and he's just kind of messing with her as she's trying to stalk him. That's still pretty, for television especially, that's a pretty intense sequence there.
Yeah, because and at the same time too, Buffy is generally all that's standing, or so you're led to believe, between the Master's domination and the safety of the world. And for him to have such an easy, laughable time with her really puts that fear into the viewer. And he's played so well by Mark Metcalf, who most people know is either the maestro from Seinfeld or Niedermeyer from Animal House. That it's such a turn for what he did, but he did it so well.
I know the original plan was to have him be a recurring villain over more than one season, but they weren't sure they were going to get renewed, so they had to write a conclusion to it. And it's a real shame because he could have been used more, and he comes back a couple of other times. I mean, specifically, there's an episode in Season 3 when Cordelia wishes that Buffy never came to Sunnydale, that you see the direct result of that is the Master rose successfully because the Slayer wasn't there to stop him, and seeing him back is just awesome because he's such a different kind of vampire. Of course, if they'd gone that route, then we wouldn't have got Angelus in Season 2, and that just, Buffy without Angelus is just not worth watching, I think.
At that point, no. And again, we talked about how awesome David Boreanaz is, and a lot of that is him, but a lot of it's the character and how well layered the character is, where the reason Angel is initially a good guy, and we talked about Blade as a good guy, a vampire fighting other vampires, Angel was very much in that same vein, although it was because he was cursed with a soul by gypsies, and that he would be aware of all the evil he did and have to suffer, and he was going to spend the rest of his life trying to right those wrongs and kind of atone for it. And the only way the curse would be broken would really screw with him, because when he reached a moment of pure happiness, that he would revert back to Angelus.
Yeah, and I love watching David Boreanaz play Angelus. I mean, whether it's in Buffy Season 2 or the absolute highlight of Season 4 of Angel, I think, is when he gets to play Angelus again, because Angelus is he's kind of like Hannibal Lecter in the sense that he's evil, but you can't help but watch. And that's not the case with a lot of other, even evil, vampires, or since I just referenced Hannibal Lecter, the case of Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. He's, in some, arguably even more evil than Hannibal, especially as he's presented. But Hannibal's the one you know he's evil, but you can't not watch him, and that's kind of how I feel about Angelus.
Yeah, that was the entire fun of it, and such a well layered character. But when you have two completely opposite sides, where you like watching the heroic Angel bust up the party, but you're in fear that he's going to revert back to Angelus, but then when he does, you say, hey, I'm going along for this ride. He's the one you love to hate, and once you know the arc is coming to an end, you're cheering that he's going to be Angel again, but inside you're saying, please don't let it happen, because then the fun's over.
Yeah, it's true. And since we've been talking about Blade a little bit, I do want to we kind of mentioned that, the third Blade movie is just kind of god-awful from start to finish, and we will discuss that more next week, because they have a version of Dracula within that particular film, which is an interesting interpretation, let's say. But
you put that very nicely.
Well, I'll give kind of a spoiler. I don't hate that interpretation of Dracula. I don't like the way it's written, and I actually don't even mind Dominic Purcell. I think he's a fine actor. There's just, the issues with that version of Dracula have less to do with the theory and the actor and more with the execution. But you also have Triple H as the vampire, and we'd be remiss not to mention everyone's favorite, RVD burying. He's got to be the focus of everything, even though he hasn't won a pay-per-view match since July of last year, give or take. We'd be remiss not to mention Triple H, I think.
Jarko Grimwood.
The metal fangs, because, hey, you got to have some bling in there, right?
Surprised they weren't built out of shovels.
Oh, yeah. And to me, the fact that he got beat by Ryan Reynolds just removes any credibility of that particular character. I mean, I don't care much for
you know
Ryan
what?
Reynolds.
I'm not a big hater on Triple H.
Me
you know,
neither.
I think there was a time where it was logical. I think that time has passed by at least a decade. But you know, we'll get more into Blade 3 next week. But there's a character in there too when you're talking about heroic vampires, and Ryan Reynolds played Hannibal King was the name of the vampire, and I was really disappointed with that iteration because I think Hannibal King is a very cool character. He's a hard-drinking detective who it just so happens he was vampirized by the same guy who got Blade's mother, Deacon Frost. And he's been on this collision course trying to track him down, but because he doesn't have the resources of being, you know, centuries old, he's had to resort to becoming a private detective in order to make a living. And he's a really sloppy Sam Spade-not kind of guy, but he somehow always ended up in these adventures where his vampiric nature would be pulled out by the end of it. The thing I like in it most, too, is if you've ever seen the show Forever Night.
Yes, actually. Both my parents are huge fans of that show. I grew up kind of watching elements of that, so...
Yeah, the
I'm
Forever
familiar
Night show
with...
he was a police officer vampire who, of course, conveniently worked the graveyard shift investigations, and normally he would just try to get by doing regular detective work, and then eventually it would be revealed that there was some kind of malevolent force behind everything, and he would have to resort to being a vampire and give in to that savage nature a little bit in order to right the day. And Hannibal King was almost kind of a precursor to that, and to see what they did with him in the Blade movie where he was just a regular vampire hunter who had been bitten and not totally turned was really a shame.
He had been turned. They turned him back. They had developed their cure by that point. Well, to make matters worse, he's joking half the time because he's Ryan Reynolds and he's got to be funny, right?
Well, allegedly funny. That's up for debate, but...
Yeah, I don't find him all that funny, but again, the point being he's making a lot of jokes. Phrase it that way.
Yeah, and not the good ones either. Hannibal King was a very self-deprecating character who understood his position in life. This guy is just kind of your wisecracking, what if Spider-Man was a vampire hunter kind of guy, and it really kind of, Blade has been a hard-hitting action
hunter.
Yeah.
It's the real Spider-Man, not the Tobey Maguire and or Andrew Garfield versions where...
No, not the crying pussy Spider-Man, but the wisecracking comic book variation that we love.
I can't imagine why they couldn't impart that level of wisecracking humor that Peter Parker has into those movies, because it's such a huge part of his character.
Because apparently he's being a crying pussy is attractive to the teenage girls who they want to rope into the movies this summer.
I guess. I mean,
about crying pussy.
When I first saw the preview for The Amazing Spider-Man and Andrew Garfield is Spider-Man, of course, and the thug pulls out that knife and he goes, "Oh, you found my one weakness. It's very small knives." I went, "Yes, there's Peter Parker. There's Spider-Man," but no, that's like the only one he gets in the whole movie, which was horribly depressing.
Yeah, but we were talking about, Nick
we're
Knight
talking about
Forever Night being a precursor to Hannibal King and what a bad job they did with him. But there is a litany of heroic vampires in literature, and I think part of it was because you could tell that people tend to love these characters, and the majority had been written as evil. When you go towards Dracula, Count Orlok, and evil vampires over and over and over again, that they formed attachments to them. And I think that the creative thought behind it was, if they love the bad guys so much, they gotta love the good guys quite so much. But really, the good guys haven't been able to create that enduring legacy that the bad guys have, with very few exceptions, some of those being, Blade and Angel that we spoke of.
And I think you have to, in the case of an enduring kind of vampire hunter, you have to go with Van Helsing, at least the name. I mean, because the character has been interpreted a bunch of different ways, but he's the other, he's the other one that people recognize when you're talking about vampire hunters. They know who Van Helsing.
Yeah, and
we'll talk more about that when
he's the human one too.
Yeah, he's just, there's nothing special about Van Helsing, and we'll kind of naturally talk more about that as next week, because he's the primary opposing force to Dracula.
Yeah, but there's been
Forever
attempts
Night,
to try to recreate those.
Yeah, you
those
think it wouldn't
heroic
be that
vampires,
hard.
and they just don't stick.
It's true, and it's just kind of sad because it shouldn't be that hard. But we've hit on a lot of the major kind of vampire mythologies here. We talked a bit earlier about 30 Days of Night, and one of the, if I can just mention that I saw that in theaters. I paid money for it. Kind of wished I hadn't because I don't feel it was worth the price of admission. But one of the big problems I had was the head vampire, the leader of that clan, and I know I've seen the actor, but I don't think I've ever bothered to look up his name. He doesn't look menacing. To me, the only vampire in that group that looked menacing was the large, bald one who got fed into that, like, wood chipper device. And especially with vampires, especially the type of vampires they were going for with that, the look is so important for my money. And I'm just kind of curious with you, apart from any of the ones that we've mentioned, do you have any vampires that fit that, their appearance sticks out in your mind?
I'll say this, and it's not to come off as silly or anything like that, but you've probably seen it, I would imagine. If you haven't, I'm shocked. But most of the people listening, if you're a vampire fan, you've probably seen the movie Blackula. If you haven't, basically it breaks down as a prince named Mamuwalde of an unnamed African nation is doing business with a European named Count Dracula, who he believes is going to help him end the slave trade in Africa. Instead, Dracula wants to enhance the slave trade. He wants to take Mamuwalde's wife and make her his concubine. Mamuwalde fights, Dracula vampirizes him and traps him in a tomb. He gets freed years later in modern-day Los Angeles. When Mamuwalde transforms into Blackula, as he's dubbed by Dracula, the change that takes over him is something that I found very odd and something I haven't really seen replicated, in that he almost takes on a more werewolf kind of a change where his eyebrows become very bushy, his hair gets higher, and he all of a sudden develops very large mutton chops, which he doesn't have when he's, not in vampire form. I don't know why they thought this was the idea to make William Marshall more terrifying or explain the change, but that one has always struck out to me as just so bizarre.
Yeah, that was an odd choice as far as that goes.
I've never been able to understand it.
Maybe it could have been the budget, to be perfectly honest. They might have ran out of money to do all the prosthetics, and he was supposed to have a full beard, but he wound up just with the mutton chops.
I would guess, but aside from that, I think we talked about the prosthetics that were used in Buffy, and we talked about the Lost Boys. The Lost Boys is really the first type of time I've seen those types of prosthetics used, where it just kind of arches the skin in between the two eyes above the bridge of your nose, and changes the eyes to an extent, and the fangs come out, and it's subtle, but it's different enough that it's going to frighten you when it happens, and I think that was what Whedon kind of drew from in visualizing his vampires. So I think we have to give a little bit of credit to the effects of the Lost Boys for making that happen.
Oh, I agree.
And
I agree with that. I don't care much for the movie. That doesn't mean I can't acknowledge some of the good things about it and whatnot. Having their physical appearance change. Kiefer Sutherland going from looking like Kiefer Sutherland to suddenly having the more pronounced forehead and the scowling eyebrows, and it's effective. I'm not going to say it's not.
Yeah, we also won't say that Kiefer changed all that much in the change, but
I love
Kiefer Sutherland, as menacing as he looks without it. But the other movie I was going to bring up, and it's not really a traditional vampire movie, it's not thought of as a classic one, is From Dusk Till Dawn, where the vampires in that movie take on a much more rodent, bat-esque appearance upon changing, where they do appear human for at least a little while, and as soon as there's some kind of blood that's spilled, they all transform and get, very massively big and develop. It almost, I know it's supposed to look like a bat, but they almost wind up looking more like the creature from the Black Lagoon and Amphibian in their features. And they have the spots on them, and some of them develop wings, and some of them develop more like a bat-type body with the T-Rex arms. It was definitely different, and I applaud them for doing that, because rather than, do the traditional mold, they wanted to really amp up the effects, and of course they had Tom Savini working on the movie, who's an FX legend. And I think they did a pretty good job of creating something that looked terrifying in a modern-day world where the slasher flick had become in vogue, and supernatural villains had kind of faded out.
Can I just say, you don't consider From Dusk Till Dawn a vampire classic?
I do, but I know that the majority of people tend not to for whatever reason. Maybe because it's the involvement of Quentin Tarantino in it, or, again,
Come
it
on,
came
George
out
Clooney
during
gets
the
to
year.
kill. If I get to watch George Clooney shoot Quentin Tarantino, I'm okay with that. Plus, it has Selma Hayek. I mean, come on. That movie
I
is
think
a
any
classic.
movie with Selma Hayek is a classic, but that again is part of my male nature kicking in, because I am what I am, and that's all that I am. But it came about at a time when vampire movies, aside from very few big budget attempts, were very out of out of vogue. And what had become in vogue, especially during the 80s, was the slasher flick, the supernatural slasher who kills people by maiming them. And not necessarily vampires or werewolves or zombies were really featured as primary villains, and that's fallen out of favor. I think From Dusk Till Dawn was a good attempt at trying to get that back into play.
Oh yeah, I agree. That's one of my favorites. There's a couple others that I want to touch on here since we're in, we're not in wrap-up mode yet, but we're in the last, we're within the last half hour, so there's a few that I want to touch on. And I'm going to kind of spring this one on you, but do you watch Supernatural at all?
I've seen episodes here and there, mostly the ones dealing with the devil.
Okay, because in season 6, there's a whole arc where they're attempting to locate the progenitors of various monster species, and they refer to them as alphas. And the guy they got to play the vampire alpha, I thought, did a great job. He kind of invokes Count Orlok without having any excessive makeup on him, or any at all. I mean, apart from the basics, I think. And he also has kind of the Gus Fring, Hannibal Lecter, very still, very serene quality about him, until he decides he's going to kill you, in which case he suddenly goes from normal to terrifying. But I would encourage you to kind of. I enjoyed his performance there, and that particular version. And their take on vampires in general is actually pretty interesting. How could I forget about Daybreakers? I assume you've seen that, right?
Daybreakers is the one with Ethan Hawke.
Ethan Hawke, Sam Neill, William Dafoe's in it.
I did see that.
Yeah, I have to give a shout-out, as far as this goes, to Sam Neill's character in that, because in a world full of vampires, he somehow still manages to be kind of the most menacing. And the most, I like that whole movie because, the notion of vampires feeding on vampires and then turning into monsters like they do is a real interesting one. And I like that whole notion of, what if everyone became a vampire? And Sam Neill, great actor, still manages to be kind of the most menacing and intimidating, despite not being a member of the military or, any of a physical match for some of the other ones. He's still, you look at Sam Neill and you listen to him talk and he's the guy you got to be worried about.
I applaud that film so much for its originality, because it's obviously a concept that has to come into play at some point. What happens when the vampires win and when they succeed and when they're the dominant species and humans are few and far between? Where do you go? And then you have the idea of vampires feeding on other vampires and becoming an alpha species, and it was so good. And Sam Neill, whenever you give him the ball and tell him to run with it in an evil part, is fantastic, going all the way back to when he played the adult version of Damien from The Omen in the final chapter. This is very much like his role there, where he's kind of understated, not the most physically opposing guy, not, in any type of position to launch missiles at you or anything like that, but he is perfect at menacing you subtly.
Yeah, there's something to be said, and plus, he's in a position of power, and everyone knows, and he's not afraid to remind you of it. And yet, Daybreakers is a really good one that I've enjoyed more than once. Okay, we would be remiss, I feel, also not to mention Barnabas from Dark Shadows. Not the crappy Johnny Depp remake. That is god-awful, as about 50% of Tim Burton's work is. Now, for those of you who haven't seen it, the original 70s television show is actually, if you watch it now, there's a fair amount of humor, but it's unintentional comedy, which can be some of the best. I mean, don't get me wrong, but Barnabas is not originally designed as the kind of comedic, bumbling fish out of water that they had Johnny Depp play him. So, I haven't seen all of it, but my mom's a big fan of it, so I'm aware. So, have you seen any of the original television series, Pat, or am I
saw pretty much the entire run of it because my dad was such a fan of it, and growing up, he would subject me to afternoons of soap operas, but thankfully that one was one that was tolerable. I saw almost the entire run of Dark Shadows, and Barnabas was not even originally intended to be a part of the show. Dark Shadows was supposed to focus on just this family living in what was perceived to be a haunted mansion in the New England area, and when ratings were dipping lower and lower every week, the writers were trying to just think of what they could do, and they thought it would be fun to put a vampire on, and so they invented the character of Barnabas Collins, who is an ancestor of the titular Collins family living in the home, and it wound up being such a hit that Barnabas became the star of the show. But we talked about the notion of vampires being romanticized, the one thing I can say Dark Shadows maybe did better than anything else is they did make Barnabas sort of a tragic figure in that he was constantly searching for this lost love, Josephine, that had killed herself when he was vampirized and she found out about it. Or Josette, excuse me. But Barnabas, in order to try to win her back, went to just evil, nefarious means constantly. You know, he tried to turn women into his vampire bride and force them to live as Josette. He threatened the doctor with her life that she needed to come up with a cure for him, or she needed to find a way to memory wipe these other girls to make them believe they're Josette. Constantly fed on people, dealt, and they would make him an anti-hero at times, but when it was convenient. But he was really a vampire who, at nature, was absolutely evil and despicable and would do anything to reach his own means.
And thank heavens for that, because, like I said, a huge failing of the movie, I mean, among other things, was the notion that Johnny Depp's version, the version that they portrayed in the movie, was not like that at all, and it was a huge detriment to the entire production, I feel. And I mean, if anyone's seen it and disagreed, feel free to let me know.
I didn't see it, but I've heard it was very much fish out of water comedy story, almost like when you had classics in the 80s, like My Best Friend is a Vampire, but not anywhere near as well done.
Okay, we need to talk about, I'm kind of surprised I went this long without mentioning it, but one of the best vampire movies ever, I feel. I mean, and feel free to disagree with me, but we need to talk a little bit about Ely from Let the Right One In, because
oh, yeah.
Child vampires are kind of inherently scary just by their nature, and Ely was kind of a step above. She was, you saw her and you just kind of knew something was off, even if you didn't know everything about it. And they just kind of did this slow burn with her. And I mean, she had fed on people, she'd attacked a couple of people, and there's that great sequence where she attacks the guy under the bridge. And again, being I think it's Swedish cinema.
It is.
Yeah, it's Swedish or Danish, or it's Swedish, but I couldn't remember which one it was specifically. But it has those same sensibilities. So more is kind of made out of the artistry of this hot red blood laying on the falling snow than out of her ripping the guy's throat out. But she's still she's still quite scary when she goes into vampire mode. And the fact that at the end, and I apologize if I'm spoiling this for anyone who hasn't seen it. At the end of the movie, when the poor kid who's been picked on is being held under the water by the older brother of the kid who he broke his nose with a pole. The kid was bullying him, and he fought back, smacked him in the face with this thing, and now his older brother wants to get back, and he's holding him under the water with one hand, and in the background you see his other arm drop into the water, and it's out of focus, but it's just slowly falling through this pool, and the red is spreading out, and this poor kid doesn't even know he's been saved yet because he still feels the other arm on top of his head.
Yeah, I can actually say that that's one of the few movies where I've seen where they did the American adaptation and still kept the heart of the movie and did it well. They did the American version, Just Let Me In, and had a very good cast with veteran actors like Richard Jenkins, Elias Koteas, and good kids to adapt the roles from the Swedish version. But I do feel the Swedish version, Let the Right One In, is superior. And the portrayal of the little girl who's seemingly harmless, if not just a little strange, as an absolute predator who is capable of mind-numbing amounts of damage to a human and just the most vicious feedings you'll see where the walls are splattered with blood everywhere. So phenomenal. And at its heart, it's kind of a story of friendship and acceptance and anti-bullying, but at the same time, you realize that once it's over, because her long time, I guess you'd call a caretaker, for lack of a better word, is dead, the boy takes on the role. So she's not totally doing this as a heroic gesture. She needs a new caretaker, and she knows he's the only one right now capable of doing it. So it's an act of self-preservation. She still can't go out in the sun. Yeah. Can't go out in the sun. Can't lure victims in during the day, or, can't do it herself all the time. So it's really, and there is that notion of friendship and camaraderie, but really it's an act of self-preservation by the vampire, who at its nature is a hunter and a survivor.
Yeah, and I haven't seen the remake yet. I know I need to because I've heard good things about it. But and again, since I haven't seen the remake, I can't speak to this one. But one of the other sequences in the Swedish original that I personally still sticks with me is the sequence where the kid, and again, pardon me for forgetting his name. He's talking to her, and she's outside of his door, and she says, "You have to invite me in." He says, "No, I'm not going to invite you in," but he kind of motions her inside because he wants to see what'll happen. And she steps into his house without being invited, and very slowly she starts shaking. The whole building kind of starts shaking. Blood starts coming out of her eyes and her fingernails, and it just seems like she's very slowly being torn apart because that's not a place she's supposed to be.
And again, that's playing to the common mythology that we know or should know of vampires, which oftentimes gets too lost in the translation of what they're trying to do. So I really enjoyed that part of it as well.
Yeah, and again, it's nice to see that a good vampire movie can still be made. And again, I'm not trying to be down on the Twilight movies here. For those of you who are fans of them, I haven't seen any of them, but from what I understand, there are some good points to, especially some of the later ones. But to see when it gets done really right, it's a great thing to watch. And apparently, I haven't seen one of them, but apparently both of those are quite good at it. Now, the other one another one of the ones, there's a couple that I want to get to here as we're kind of wrapping up. I want to get your impression of, because I haven't seen it yet. Where'd it go? I had it written down. Crud.
There, folks. You can't beat it.
No, you can't. I can't find. It'll come to me again in a minute here. But well, since again, this is another one that we'd kind of be remiss not to mention, at least in passing, since it's popular and it's coming back, ladies and gentlemen. True Blood, which is an interesting concept of vampires being out there and now coming out and wanting to be part of the rest of the world, and at least that's where it starts. And of course, it goes on to encompass a lot more than that. But I haven't seen a whole lot of True Blood, so I'm kind of going to rely on you, assuming you've seen a lot of it. But how do the vampires in that, as far as that goes, stack up?
I watched the first two seasons, 2.5 seasons of True Blood as a regular viewer. I thought it was an interesting take as far as vampires trying to integrate themselves into society in this, small Louisiana community. It's based on a series of novels, the Sookie Stackhouse Diaries or journals or whatever you call them. Alexander Skarsgård is often given a lot of credit for his portrayal on the show of his vampire, but ultimately I'm not a fan of True Blood. And I'll say this, I don't think it's anything to do with the vampires and how they're portrayed. I think it's a matter of it's trying to be an adult version of Twilight and acting as if it's better because it's violent and holds somewhat more true to the mythologies of the vampire. Somewhat more true. Everybody who bags on Twilight...
As far as that goes, I do have to say I'll take Anna Paquin over Kristen Stewart.
Well, she looks like she showers, so that's a plus. But the people who bag on Twilight because the vampires, nothing happens to them in the sunlight, are forgetting that in the very first episode of True Blood, vampires are filmed having sex. Now, a staunch, mythology of vampires, and the one that stayed true, is that vampires can't be captured on film or seen in a mirror because they don't have souls. So without explanation, vampires can easily be seen and photographed and viewed on video camera without any type of rationale behind it. So right there, trying to pretend that True Blood is the greatest thing because it holds true to the myth and portrays vampires as they should be instead of Twilight is absurd. But I didn't like the expansion of the universe so fast in True Blood, and that's kind of what turned me off, where they've included fairies with all kinds of odd powers, and they constantly keep expanding the characters in the universe, and I just tuned out. I know it's popular, a lot of people love it, and that's great, but it's not ultimately for me.
No, fair enough. I mean, I've seen a couple of episodes, but it just, it didn't really kind of capture me or suck me in. Okay, there it is. The other one, there's two more that I want to touch on, and I don't know how much you'll want to talk about one of them, but another one that we'd kind of be remiss not to mention, at least as far as if you're a hardcore vampire fan goes, is Ed Lee from the Fright Night movie.
Evil Ed,
reimagined by Colin Farrell.
Actually, that was Jerry Dandridge.
What, in the second one, in the remake?
No, in both. Jerry Dandridge is the lead vampire. Evil Ed is initially portrayed by I forget the actor's name in the first one, but in the second one it's the kid who played McLovin.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Sorry, I got them confused. But, yeah, Jerry Dandridge, so, yeah, we do need to talk about him.
Jerry Dandridge.
I mean, the original 1985 Fright Night, one of the better vampire movies, by and large. I mean, yes, it is an 80s horror movie, so there's certain things that you can pick up on. But you got Chris Sarandon as Jerry Dandridge, and Prince Humperdinck being a vampire is not a bad thing, I think.
The thing that made Chris Sarandon great is, vampires have always had the perceived notion of they're very good-looking and charming people, and Chris Sarandon has very, perfect features. He's got a strong jaw. His hair is well coiffed, or whatever you want to call it. And when he actually does go into his vampiric nature, he has this ridiculous mouth of sharp fangs throughout, the long Nosferatu fingernails, total 180, and really ramped up in the creature feature department on it. But has that duality that makes some of the better vampires, and he just, rocks it to a T.
So since we talked about, how would you rate his as opposed to Colin Farrell's version of Jerry Dandridge in the 2011 remake?
I didn't mind Colin Farrell's version really at all. To capture the, Colin Farrell sitting on the couch watching The Real Housewives of New Jersey, I definitely saw that as something that Jerry Dandridge of '85 would be doing if it was, on then. Because that's what he really was, kind of a normal guy, feeds and has evil intentions. But I think the difference in the movies is that they didn't give Farrell the leeway that they gave to Chris Sarandon, and they had much less screen time devoted to Colin Farrell for whatever reason than they did Jerry Dandridge as Chris Sarandon played him. The newer version, which I really could not stand at all, was much more focused on the Charlie Brewster character, Anton Yelchin, who I just find annoying and unlikable, whereas William Ransdale was a lot of fun in the first movie. And I think because Chris Sarandon got more screen time and they realized that the vampire is a lot of the draw, they really wrote him a lot more layered and gave him more to play with in terms of the scenes where he would vampirize people, like when he approaches Evil Ed in the alleyway after they walked Amanda Bierce's character of Amy home, and he kind of just talks him down, they won't pick on you anymore, they won't beat you up, I'll see to that. All you have to do is take my hand. And he's got his very normal appearance, and then all of a sudden you see him extend the hand and the fingernails and the ring are out and the skin is somewhat ragged, and that's one of the better scenes in that movie, and Chris Sarandon just delivered every time. I think Colin Farrell's problem was he didn't get the opportunities that Chris Sarandon did in the new version, and I think that's where a lot of it fell flat.
Well, I liked elements of what he did. I mean, that sequence when the kid's sitting there saying, you can't come in unless I invite you in, and his response is, well, I could just blow up your house.
Yeah, they made him just a lot more singularly menacing. Yeah,
and which was kind of sad, but Chris Sarandon also did a great job portraying another one of my favorite villains. He did a version of Herbert West, Reanimator, where he was the titular Herbert West, and just a fantastic job as a Lovecraftian character. And since we're under 10 minutes, the other one I would feel a bit remiss, even though he's not a bad guy, and may kind of be off-putting as far as since this is a show focused on bad guys, but for anyone who's seen the Hellsing, whether you read the manga or have seen the television comic or follow the OVAs, if you've seen Alucard, to me, he's in a lot of ways, he is the perfect vampire, and part of that's because he's Dracula, so we might revisit this next week when we talk specifically about Dracula, but I wouldn't feel comfortable talking about vampires in general without talking about Alucard from Hellsing. So, do you follow that at all, or am I going to be solo here for a couple of minutes talking about this?
I think you're going to be flying solo. The only real manga I've seen like that and followed to an extent was Vampire Hunter D.
Another good one, but I would encourage you to find Hellsing.
I'm sure it's on Netflix.
Might be. You can probably order it, put it in your DVD queue to get it. But yeah, there's two versions. The television, there was a limited run television series, all animated, of course, but there's a limited edition run on television that ran for one season that towards the end diverges pretty dramatically from the source material, and then because it's a popular manga, you have OVAs, original video animations that come out kind of with as the new editions come out. But Alucard is, to my mind, almost the perfect vampire, and it's revealed that he's Dracula, so I apologize if I spoil that for anyone.
Just spelling the name backwards doesn't give it away.
I know. But he actually makes a couple of jokes about that throughout the course of it. But his character is very different as far as, even from Dracula. I mean, since we'll be talking about Dracula next week, he is portrayed as his whole goal is to find someone who can kill him. But he's so obscenely powerful, He has magic at his disposal. You can't kill him. I mean, I don't think, sunlight doesn't kill him. He's been decapitated, and that doesn't kill him because his power is based on the number of lives that he's taken. And he's taken, millions of lives, and he's just so, his whole goal is and stated purpose is, I want to find someone who can kill me. And he's actually in service to the Helsing family, which is a descendant of Abraham Van Helsing, is the one who captured him and magically bound him to his family, is kind of how that works out. But some of his verbal exchanges with other characters, and just when you see him let loose with what he can do with his power, it's downright scary. He is, despite being a good guy on the right side, he can be absolutely terrifying if he wants to be. And everything, I'm a huge fan of that whole series, and Alucard's a big part of that. So, all right, since we're under 5 minutes here, Pat, are there any others that you feel we've missed? Are there any other vampires that you want to get in here before we start wrapping things up? Anything we've overlooked?
I'll say this. If you've never seen it, there was a great made-for-television movie in the 70s called The Night Stalker. It centers around an investigative reporter named Carl Kolchak, played by Darren McGavin, who is stalking what's perceived to be a serial killer who believes himself to be a vampire. And they kind of seed of doubt you the whole time throughout the movie that, okay, this guy, he's a wacko, he's not actually a vampire. Until finally, you see things like him getting shot at point-blank range and nothing happening to him. And finally, towards the end of the movie, the big climax, and spoiler alert, you know this show by now, we do spoilers. Kolchak breaks into the guy's house that he's been staying in after tracking him down. And finally, he's hiding in the closet at one point to not be found. And the guy peels the closet door open, and you see this menacing, 6'5" figure who looks a lot like Killer Kowalski, if you're a wrestling fan. He looks a lot like Killer Kowalski, but with vampire fangs, if Kowalski himself isn't terrifying enough. And then you know that this guy is legitimately a vampire, and he's been feeding on these girls throughout Las Vegas. And it's up to Kolchak to kind of save the day because he's the only one crazy enough to believe this. But Janos Skorzeny is the name of the vampire. It's
that's
fantastic
a great
portrayal by Barry Atwater.
That's a great made-for-television movie. It spawned a short-lived series, kind of sad.
And it's the basis for the X-Files, according to Chris Claremont, or Chris Cooper, who created it.
Yeah, if you haven't seen the X-Files vampire episode, it's hilarious. I mean, that's a great show that balances humor with serious situations, and there's an episode that they do that focuses on, it turns out to be a small town that's populated entirely by vampires.
Featuring Luke Wilson.
I hate Luke Wilson. I really do. But
stop.
Almost as much as I hate Owen Wilson. But God,
okay, as long as you hate Owen more, that's all that matters.
I can't hate Luke more. He's not been around as much. I mean, if Luke had more exposure, I'd probably hate him more because he's got the one look with his pinched face. But I can't. I don't hate Luke as much as I hate Owen. Owen's just been around a lot more, and so with more exposure comes more dislike. I mean, some of my favorite movies are movies where I get to watch people that I don't like die. I mean, for my money, that's a huge plus for both the movies Armageddon and Anaconda because, hey, Owen Wilson dies. I'm okay with this.
So are you eventually going to convince everybody on a podcast that Owen Wilson is a bad guy?
Owen Wilson's not the type of bad guy that should be praised or discussed. He's the kind of bad guy who you think, why do you keep making movies?
You hear that, Owen Wilson? You're not getting a podcast, so suck it.
You don't get one. Vince Vaughn doesn't get one. Will Ferrell doesn't get one. Just because I hate you doesn't make you a bad guy. Because if I did podcasts based solely on who I hated, we'd have 8 of them dedicated to Ben Stiller done by now.
Well, that's what makes you the bad guy, Robert.
My hatred for Ben Stiller, if properly channeled, could power small countries. I need to get that out there.
You hear that, Taiwan? The hard times are over.
Taiwan's not third world. I could power what's that little South America or Central America? I can't remember.
They're all little.
They're all little, yeah. Or one of those
just
small
made a number of enemies.
I apologize. I used to know them all. I can't remember. Costa Rica's pretty small. There's one. It's like one word, and I can't remember it for the life of. Or any of those small I could power Vatican City for decades, which is its sovereign government. Or any of the small, former Soviet ones, like Latvia, Estonia, I could power them. But my hatred for Ben Stiller knows no bounds.
And he's never played a vampire, so he's got that working against him, too.
Yeah. I mean, let me just say this. If I were the Hulk, the mention of Ben Stiller would make me destroy a small planet. put it out there as a shout-out to Mark Radulich in our Hulk series. Well, that's pretty much going to wrap up this discussion of non-Dracula vampires. Next week, same day, same time, if that works for you, Pat.
Same Pat time, same Pat channel.
We will be discussing Dracula and all his various iterations, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and there's more than enough of all three to go around. Is there anything you want to plug this week, Pat? We don't have the Ground and Pound show this week because there's really nothing to talk about, so we're skipping a week with that. Your comic book podcast that you keep trying to get off the ground, how's that coming?
Grounded. Grounded for the moment, waiting to take flight.
Well, let me know if you ever get it going. I'm looking forward to that. You've got a couple of great guys as far as contributors go. I mean, both Steve Gustafson and Sean Lelos have great columns in the 411 music and TV zone, or movies and television, not music, that just once a week that talk.
Alternate takes and Comics 411. I read them every week. They're both fantastic, and I'm looking forward to see if all three of us can get on the same page and finally nail this thing down.
Yeah, I was heard a bit last week. It seemed everyone did a villain-themed column in the Movie Zone last week, and I wasn't invited.
You're a trendsetter, man. What can you say?
Well, plus, I actually enjoyed, I think it was whoever did, no, it might have been Sean Lelos who talked about his favorite comic book movie villains.
Movie villains? That was Sean.
Yeah, and I think I posted on his thread, wait a minute, they were talking about bad guys. There was one on, I think their top 5 that week was movie villains, and for some reason they all thought Emperor Palpatine was ranked highly, and no, I'm the authority, people. You should ask me about these things. I demand consultation rights.
Well, they've spurned you, and that only serves to further your evil domination plans and give you more salt in the wound to really go ahead and take vengeance.
It does. I'm going to find Larry Zonka. I'm going to take over the website. Then I'm going to make him do the same job that he has now, but for less money, after locking him into an unbreakable contract, because I know how to be evil in corporate America, too. So is there anything you want to plug this week, Pat?
I just remind everybody there's no Ground and Pound radio this Sunday because the only review we'd have is Invicta, and no big news is broken this week. We will be back the following week where we will actually have relevant topics to talk about.
I was kind of sad we didn't get you on this week to talk about the downfall of Anderson Silva.
Yeah, I thought about it, and as I watched the fight again afterward, thanks to the machinations of DVR, I got progressively angrier at Anderson Silva watching that fight, and figured if I was going to talk, it would have been a profanity-laced tirade that nobody would have been safe from.
Yeah, I agree. It's one thing to drop your hands against Forrest Griffin, who has no punching power, and to goof around when you know that Talos Slade is going to shoot in and then flop to his back, but you can't fight like that against Chris Weidman. That's a bad idea.
No, and any guy with a relevant skill set, you shouldn't do as much as he did, and watching it and then the post-fight interview, if you want to talk about a bad guy, there's your bad guy right there. He just went from the number 3 heel spot to the number 1 heel spot.
You think he passed Michael Bisping finally, saying he doesn't want a rematch?
Oh, he's past Michael Bisping.
Well, you know that as far as Dana White concerns, Chris Weidman is the number 1 bad guy because he robbed him of super fights, which we all know Anderson wasn't going to do anyway because GSP doesn't want to fight Anderson Silva, and Anderson Silva doesn't really want to fight John Jones.
Yeah, but on the plus side now, he only has to pay his middleweight champion $50,000.
It's true. All right, and yeah, no Ground and Pound this week. We'll return next week because we'll have news and a card to break down. As for me, Locked in the Guillotine every Friday, looking at news, relevant cards, the whole 9 yards in the MMA zone. This week I am breaking down UFC 162, The Fall of the Spider. I don't know, what would that make Weidman? What eats spiders? The skunk.
Birds.
Actually, skunks eat spiders. So Anderson Silva can be the skunk.
That's true. The skunks, birds, whatever you want to go with. Either way it fits.
Also, I was thinking specifically skunks because they feed on black widows. And, Anderson's a spider and he's black. I don't know if he's a widow.
No, because he changed his family's life, if you didn't hear him say that 8 times in the interview.
He had to put over America. Come on. He's going for the disingenuous heel run.
And nobody beats the Rougeos.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so Locked in the Guillotine in the MMA zone on Friday. I am currently up against Todd Vogt in the MMA Factor Fiction settings. I believe I'm staring down my 5th consecutive defeat. I'm the Leonard Garcia of Factor Fiction in MMA, folks. All right, and
I disagree. I believe you're the guy who gets robbed of the decision yet has earned it, as opposed to Leonard Garcia, who does not earn the decision and gets the win.
I meant the losing streak, not whether or not I win on unwarranted decisions.
Fair
All
enough.
right, but that's going to wrap this one up talking about vampires. As we mentioned, next week, same time, same channel, we will be here talking specifically about Dracula. I'll have Pat back. It will be awesome. I encourage you all to look for that. I will also have my outro clip. I know I promised I'd have one this week. I didn't get around to it. I couldn't find the one I wanted, actually, and then I realized there was a better one about 5 minutes before we went on air, so I'll have it next week. I promise we will exit with Scarface saying, "Say goodnight to the bad guy." So, at the moment, for Pat Mullin, I am Robert Winfree, reminding you all that the shadows are dark. That makes the light bright, people. Respect the villains. And I will see you next week, same time. Until then, have a good day.